Now, the pen, they say, is mightier than the sword, but they also say don't bring a knife to a gunfight, and a pen, of course, would be even less use at that point. But words and information can be used as a weapon of war, and used early enough might even save you from the many costs of kinetic operations. Well, that's the argument put forward in a new book called Subversion, the Strategic Weaponization of Narratives. And the author is Dr. Andreas Krieg, who's a senior lecturer at King's College and the Royal College of Defence Studies. Andreas, just explain in simple terms what we're talking about. What is a narrative and why is adjusting it so powerful?
Hi, thanks for having me. So a narrative is basically the storyline that we use to kind of package our information and facts that we want to transport. So when we communicate, we obviously don't communicate via facts, we communicate via stories. So we're all engaged in using narratives on a daily basis, and it can mobilize and demobilize depending on how you frame a particular issue. And, we've seen that with media narratives. And so they can be weaponized, and the better you do it, particularly in a day of hyperconnectivity in the age of social media, the better you do it, the more you can actually influence, the more you can mobilize, the more you can polarize, and the more you can achieve the objectives of warfare, which is about changing your opponent's will without actually using kinetic force or violence.
I mean, in the 21st century, you mentioned there, we're talking about social media. Is that the sort of key means of delivery of this sort of narrative adjustment?
Weaponized narratives have been around forever, obviously, but the interconnectivity that has come with social media has made it much easier to actually penetrate target audiences from afar. But I would also say it's not only about social media. It's about using academia, using newspapers and general media, policymakers, PR companies, and a huge host of different intermediaries that can help you transport narratives. So it's not just social media, but social media can really bring you the mass and the deep penetration.
You mentioned Russia a lot in the book as the experts at this, if you like, in terms of weaponizing these narratives. I mean, how have they done that? We know about the elections in the US, for instance, in the past few years. How have they weaponized narratives there?
So, yeah, that's kind of the standard example that everyone is using, what Russia has been doing during the US elections, particularly 2016 and 2020, but also during the Brexit vote here in the UK. What they have tried is they have tapped into existing grievances within local organic audiences, people who are disenfranchised, who feel that they have not been really protected by those elites, for example, people who have anti-government sentiments and are receptive to alternative narratives about how the world works. And what the Russians have done over years and years, and that's very important, they probably start around 2014 in the United States. And we see the first result in 2016, where they have really polarized the political discourse prior to the election of Donald Trump, not only to get Trump elected, but also to kind of bash and undermine the integrity of Hillary Clinton at the time, basically making it ever more difficult for audiences, civil society to come together and agree on a particular issue. But they've done it across Africa as well. And here, this is why I'm using also United Arab Emirates as a small state that has emulated the Russians. They've done it in Egypt, they've done it in Tunisia. What weaponized narratives have done is creating an information context or pretext for the military to intervene and overthrow existing governments.
So, our audience will be very, very familiar with psyops and information operations. How is this different, nuanced in a way from that?
It's not different at all. PSYOPs are part of subversion campaigns. PSYOPs, though, are usually used in a very tactical or maybe at best in an operational context where it's about a particular fairly small contained operation. I think what we're missing with PSYOPs, and I think this is where we need to go next, we need to understand how we do this strategically so that we can actually shift audiences strategically to ensure that our adversary never goes to war, never goes to that, comes close to that military threshold, and doing that preventively. And the important bit of this is it has to be done constantly.
So, of course, the British military has been engaged in this sort of information operations for many years. We have 77 Brigade. How could that capability be expanded?
I think that's an important point. The capability exists in its infancy, but it obviously needs to be expanded if we were to compete with countries like Russia, Iran, China. And I think we need to move away from that idea that these are people in uniform who are sitting behind their computers and operating on behalf of the state. I think what it comes to is developing networks, information networks, as I'm talking about in my book. And networks are kind of the antithesis to a military hierarchy. And that's why I think that sort of capability shouldn't necessarily rest with the army or with the uniformed unit, but should be a network that is tied into an institution quite centrally in the UK that sits strategically above the military, sits strategically above the MOD and other institutions, and draws on all the networks that the UK has to offer. Because it is about not only building networks, but also using and tapping into the networks, influence networks that the UK already has, of which many, if not most, are actually not under the control of the military or the government. Obviously, we've been involved in operations. 7th Brigade has been involved in operations quite successfully since 2014 vis-a-vis Russia, when we saw the invasion of the Donbass and also Crimea. I think what 7th Brigade has done already in the Baltic states is kind of really building consensus around issues whenever Russia wanted to try to exploit a particular issue in the Baltic states. It was quite successful, the 7th Brigade, in supporting local audiences, in creating more resilience against those narratives, weaponized narratives coming from Russia, and by creating a robust core of within these audiences to fight back. And obviously that has taken years and years to do, but again, it's quite bespoke, it's fairly tactical, or if maybe operational, but it's not really put together into and integrated into much broader network, which is what it requires.
Dr. Krieg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, there's much more from my conversation with Dr. Andreas Krieg in an extra edition of the SitRep podcast, which is online now. In it, we talk about the importance of this narrative for maintaining Western support to Ukraine, for instance, and the joint US-UK Operation Ajax in the 1950s, which brought about a coup in Iran. Mike, let me bring you back. It just struck me talking to Andreas. America, the US tried this very bluntly after the Gulf